Titanic had been built to make the North Atlantic feel smaller, safer, and more civilized. Yet on the night of April 14th, 1912, the most celebrated passenger ship of its age struck an iceberg and vanished in roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes. More than 1,500 people died. The paradox is not that an iceberg could damage a ship. It is that so many layers of modern protection steel compartments, wireless telegraphy, trained officers, and lifeboats failed to prevent mass death. Titanic was not one mistake, it was a chain. To understand that chain, we have to move beyond the familiar legend. Why did a ship praised for safety continue at high speed toward reported ice? Why were there boats for only about half the people aboard? And why did some leave with empty seats? Why did passenger class affect the chances of survival? And why did the disaster transform international maritime law? The answers do not reveal a single villain. They reveal something more unsettling, a system in which technology advanced faster than regulation, preparation, and the imagination of failure. At the opening of the 20th century, the Atlantic was one of the world's busiest corridors of migration, commerce, and power. European shipping lines competed for passengers traveling between old economies and expanding American cities. Cunard emphasized speed with liners such as Lusitania and Mauretania. White Star chose a different promise: immense ships, steady passages, and luxury on a scale associated with the finest hotels. Titanic emerged from that competition not merely as transportation, but as a public demonstration that industrial engineering could discipline distance, weather, and risk. Construction began at Harland and Wolff in Belfast in 1909. When completed, Titanic measured about 269 meters, or 883 feet, from bow to stern, and more than 28 meters, or 92 feet, across. Its hull enclosed engines, boilers, cargo spaces, cabins, dining rooms, working quarters, and machinery for a floating population of more than 2,000. This scale mattered. A larger ship could absorb more damage and offer more comfort, but it also placed more lives inside one technical system and made the consequences of rare failure far greater. Titanic's reputation for safety rested especially on 16 main compartments, divided by transverse bulkheads. Watertight doors could be closed from the bridge, helping isolate flooding below. The concept was sound within its design assumptions. The ship could remain afloat after serious damage to a limited number of compartments, but the bulkheads did not rise high enough throughout the vessel to stop water from moving onward once the bow settled deeply. The protection worked like a row of cups. Once one filled high enough, water could spill into the next. The ship carried several worlds at once. First class included wealthy industrialists, professionals, and families traveling in elaborate public rooms. Second class offered standards comparable to first class on many older liners. Third class carried hundreds of immigrants, many from Europe, seeking work, family, or a different future in the United States and Canada. Their accommodation was divided from other sections by the ship's class structure and by immigration controls. Everyone shared the same hull. They did not share the same routes through it, the same information, or the same proximity to the boats. Titanic left Southampton on April 10, 1912, then called at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown, now Cobb in Ireland, before heading west. About 2,200 passengers and crew were aboard. Surviving lists differ slightly on the exact total. The voyage began as a commercial crossing, not an attempt at exploration. Wireless operators exchanged navigational reports and also handled a heavy flow of private passenger messages. The ship's schedule, its service, and its confidence all belonged to normal Atlantic business. That normality is essential because catastrophe arrived without the crew believing they were approaching an extraordinary emergency. On April 14th, Messages from other ships reported icebergs and field ice near Titanic's route. Several warnings reached the bridge. Others remained within the busy wireless traffic or were not treated with equal urgency. Ice itself was not unusual in the western North Atlantic during spring. Experienced captains often maintained speed in clear conditions. Expecting lookouts to see danger in time, that custom had worked before. On Titanic, it became a critical assumption. Visibility would provide enough warning, and the ship's maneuverability would provide enough distance. Titanic continued at roughly 21 to 22 knots, about 39 to 41 kilometers per hour, or 24 to 25 miles per hour. The British Inquiry later called the speed excessive for the conditions. Yet, the popular story that the ship was racing for a transatlantic speed record is unsupported. White Star's Olympic-class liners were not designed to defeat Cunard's fastest ships. The deeper problem was ordinary practice. Speed was preserved not because one dramatic order has been proved, but because the danger had not yet overturned the habits of the industry. At about 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the lookout sighted an iceberg ahead and warned the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch ordered an evasive turn and changes to the engines. The ship began to swing, but there was too little distance. The iceberg passed along the starboard side. Many aboard felt only a vibration or a change in movement. The collision did not resemble a single crushing blow. Below, however, seawater began entering multiple forward spaces. The event that would destroy Titanic was already underway before most passengers understood that anything serious had happened. The iceberg did not need to tear one enormous continuous opening. Damage distributed along the forward hull allowed water into at least 5 compartments. That exceeded the ship's survivable design condition. As the bow settled, the surface of the sea rose relative to the internal bulkheads. Water advanced from one section to another through openings above them. Closing the watertight doors slowed movement between the lower spaces, but it could not raise the bulkheads. Titanic's safety system was functioning, and still losing, because the accident had crossed the boundary for which the system was designed. Shipbuilder Thomas Andrews and senior officers inspected the damage. The conclusion was not a matter of symbolism or panic. It followed from the geometry of flooding. With too many forward compartments open to the sea, the bow would continue downward, and water would progress aft. The ship could not be saved. Yet this knowledge was held by only a small number of people, while many passengers remained inside public rooms or cabins. The disaster, therefore, entered a second phase, not preventing the sinking, but communicating danger and moving more than 2,000 people before time ran out. Within minutes, the wireless room began sending distress calls first, CQD, and also the newer SOS signal. Ships across the North Atlantic heard fragments of the emergency. Carpathia, more than 50 nautical miles away, turned toward Titanic. Other vessels were too distant. A ship seen in the area became the center of controversy because it did not respond in time. The identity, distance, and observations involved remained disputed. Wireless had extended Titanic's voice far beyond the horizon, but rescue still depended on another ship's location, readiness, and speed. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats with space for roughly 1,178 people. That was more capacity than British regulations required, because the rules were based largely on tonnage categories created before ships had grown to Titanic's scale. Compliance therefore concealed inadequacy. The ship could legally sail with boats for far fewer people than it could carry. Its davits could also have handled additional boats, but only 20 were installed. The central failure was not secret illegality. It was a legal standard that treated an emergency fleet as a supplement, not as seats for everyone aboard. Preparation was equally weak. At Southampton, only 2 lifeboats had been lowered during the inspection drill, and there had been no full passenger evacuation exercise. During the sinking, no modern public address system existed to deliver one clear message throughout the vessel. Officers interpreted the instruction to prioritize women and children differently. Crews were uncertain about boat capacities and loading procedures. Some passengers hesitated to leave a large, brightly equipped liner for a small open boat. The result was not one moment of panic, but uneven information, delayed movement, and boats lowered before every place was filled. Class did not determine every individual outcome, but it strongly shaped time and access. Historical tallies used by the United States Senate inquiry found that about 60% of first-class passengers survived, compared with roughly 42% in second class and 25% in third. Women and children were favored across classes, yet third-class families faced longer routes from lower decks, unfamiliar layouts, language differences, and slower access to reliable instructions. The disaster did not create the ship's hierarchy. It exposed what hierarchy meant when the most valuable resource was no longer money or comfort, but minutes. As the angle of the decks increased, the evacuation accelerated. Some early boats had left with substantial empty capacity. Later boats were loaded more heavily, while the final collapsible craft became difficult to launch as water reached the boat deck. Crew members continued operating machinery, electricity, pumps, and wireless equipment, while others worked the davits. Their actions bought time but could not create more boats. By the final stage, the shortage was absolute. Hundreds of people remained aboard a ship whose last practical exits were disappearing. Shortly after 200 a.m., the bow was deeply submerged and the stern rose higher. The hull then broke apart before the sections descended separately. Some survivors had reported a break, while early inquiries remained uncertain. The wreck would confirm it decades later. At about 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic. People in the water faced temperatures near the freezing point of seawater. Most of the lifeboats did not return quickly to the crowd, and only a small number were pulled alive from the sea after the ship had gone. Carpathia's captain, Arthur Rostron, ordered his ship toward the distressed position and prepared for survivors before reaching the scene. Extra lookouts watched for ice. Medical stations, blankets, hot drinks, and spaces for rescued passengers were organized. The ship drove through the same dangerous region that Titanic had entered hours earlier. Carpathia could not arrive before the sinking. It could only reach the boats. At approximately 4:10 a.m., it took aboard the first survivors. The rescue continued for hours, turning a passenger liner into an improvised receiving station for a catastrophe. By morning, roughly 700 survivors were aboard Carpathia. More than 1,500 passengers and crew were missing or dead. Exact totals vary among historical lists. Entire families had been divided. Southampton lost large numbers of crew members whose households depended on maritime wages. Migrant communities across Europe and North America waited for names transmitted by wireless and printed in newspapers. The scale of the loss was not produced by luxury alone. It included stewards, engineers, firemen, sailors, domestic workers, children, and emigrants whose journeys ended before they reached the continent they had chosen. The sea offered almost no visible explanation for what had happened. Titanic rested more than 3,700 meters over 12,000 feet below the surface, beyond the reach of 1912 technology. The evidence that remained was carried by survivors, wireless records, ship plans, lifeboats, and the decisions documented afterward. This mattered because memory immediately began simplifying the event. A perfect ship had met an unstoppable iceberg. Heroes and cowards were assigned. Rumors became scenes. But the official investigations had to examine a harder question. Which failures were exceptional, and which had been accepted as normal? The United States Senate opened hearings within days. A British wreck commissioner's inquiry followed in London. Together, they examined ice warnings, speed, construction, lifeboats, wireless practice, crew preparation, class, and the failure of nearby assistance. The inquiries did not agree on every point or assign responsibility in the same way. The British court concluded that collision with an iceberg brought about by excessive speed caused the loss. The American report was harsher toward emergency preparation and regulation. Both exposed the same broad truth. The disaster had been made worse by preventable institutional weaknesses. The first enduring myth is that everyone believed Titanic was literally impossible to sink. The reality is more precise. Publicity and technical writing described Olympic-class ships as practically unsinkable, and confidence in compartmentation became part of Titanic's reputation. But engineers understood that every design had limits. The tragedy did not prove that watertight subdivision was useless. It proved that safety language can become dangerous when a conditional claim is repeated as an absolute promise. Titanic was not lost because people trusted engineering. It was lost partly because trust was not matched by equal attention to failure beyond the design case. The second myth seeks one command that doomed the ship, a demand to arrive early, gain publicity, or break a record. No reliable evidence proves that J. Bruce Ismay ordered Captain Edward Smith to chase a transatlantic record, and Titanic could not match Cunard's fastest liners. This does not make the speed harmless. It makes the failure more systemic. Captain Smith maintained a pace later judged excessive while entering reported ice, but he acted within a professional culture that often relied on clear weather and lookout detection. The catastrophe came from accepted judgment failing under exceptional consequences. The nearby ship Californian remains one of the most disputed parts of the story. Its wireless operator had gone off duty before Titanic's distress calls. Officers later reported seeing rockets from a vessel, but no rescue was attempted during the critical period. The 1912 inquiries strongly criticized Californian and placed it close enough to have helped. A British reappraisal in 1992 reconsidered positions and visibility, producing disagreement over the distance and even whether the ships directly saw one another. The safe conclusion is limited. Warning signals were not acted upon with the urgency the situation required. For 73 years, the wreck remained unseen. In 1985, a joint American-French expedition led by teams from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and IFRIMER searched the seabed with new sonar and camera systems. Instead of looking only for one intact hull, they followed a trail of debris. On September 1st, a boiler appeared in the images more than 12,400 feet below. The wreck showed the bow and stern, separated across the seabed, confirming that Titanic had broken apart. Discovery replaced one uncertainty with physical evidence, but it also revealed the site as the grave of more than 1,500 people. The most important legacy was not the wreck. It was the redesign of maritime safety. In 1914, nations adopted the first international convention for the safety of life at sea, known as SOLAS, in direct response to Titanic. New standards addressed lifeboat capacity, drills, emergency duties, and radio watchkeeping. The International Ice Patrol began monitoring iceberg danger near the Grand Banks. These reforms did not make the ocean harmless. They changed the philosophy of regulation. A passenger ship should prepare not only to resist an accident, but to evacuate everyone and summon help when resistance fails. That lesson remains modern. Complex systems rarely collapse because one component is worthless. They fail when several reasonable assumptions align in the wrong direction. Warnings are normalized, rules lag behind scale, rehearsals are incomplete, information moves unevenly, and backup capacity exists only on paper. Titanic's steel was advanced. Its wireless was advanced. Its compartmentation was advanced. Yet the safety of the whole system was weaker than the reputation of its parts. Technology can reduce risk. It cannot replace preparation, regulation, communication, or the decision to slow down. Titanic crossed from confidence into catastrophe in roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes. The iceberg opened the hull, but the scale of death was shaped by everything around that impact. Speed, design limits, outdated rules, too few boats, uneven access, weak rehearsal, and delayed response. That is why the story endures beyond the ship's size or luxury. Titanic reminds us that safety is not a label attached to a machine. It is a chain of decisions, tested before the emergency, shared across every class, and built to remain strong when confidence is no longer enough.